thanks everyone for coming back. We're going to continue with some of our presenters, and this one I would like to proudly introduce Sayeed for a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. Sayeed, there you go.
Thanks, Jacob. Really, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm Sayeed Choudhury from Johns Hopkins University. I work in the library system at Hopkins, but my background is actually in engineering. And I wanted to give you some perspective and insights from this background that I have. I'll begin with a quote from my advisor in graduate school. He was telling me about engineering, and he said something to me that it falls in that category of advice you get from someone who's more wise and thoughtful than you are, maybe at least at that stage in your life, or relative to where he or she may be. It didn't really sink in when I first heard it, but it stayed with me, and it stays with me throughout my life. And it continues to be something that I think about. And that is, he said, engineering is a liberal art. And I distinctly remember the reaction I had when I first heard this, just something along the lines of, what the hell is he talking about? Because I was learning about math and statistics and computation and data and algorithms and so on. And what he said to me was, those are important, don't get me wrong, those are the foundations. You have to know how to do those things to be an engineer. But those are methods, those are a means to an end. Don't get confused and assume that that is the end of what engineering is about. What he said to me was that engineering is actually about people, processes, products, and the workflows that connect them, particularly the workflows. And he said in many cases what engineers tend to do is go right to the product. Right? And they focus on that one part of the triad and ignore the other aspects and don't necessarily think about the workflows that connect them. And he said, you can be a perfectly fine engineer, you can even be a good engineer if all you do is think about the product. And there are a lot of people who do that, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you want to be the best kind of engineer, at least in his opinion, then you need to think about this triad of people, processes, products, and the workflows that connect them. And then you also need to reach out to other people, because somewhat sadly, engineering education isn't going to necessarily prepare you to address all of the aspects of this triad. Depending on what you learn, depending on where you go, you might pick up different pieces, but there are always going to be others who can help you address these different dimensions. And in many ways, what I tend to think of is, at least in the university context, the open source program office sits in the middle of this. So if you look at a university, which is a large, complex organization, in many ways similar to what you have, but in many ways very different, this is the office that we think can sit in the middle of this sort of interplay and play an important role. So looking at a place like Hopkins, Johns Hopkins is very proud of the fact that for 39 years in a row, we have received more federal and private foundation funding than any other university in the United States. So the last time we collected these statistics, or we have these statistics in 2017, depending on how you count, it's roughly $2.6 billion of revenue coming into the institution. To give you a sense of benchmarks, number 2 on the list is University of Michigan, a full $1 billion less at $1.6 billion. The top 10 are mainly large state universities, simply because of the scale and the size they have. 3 other institutions that Hopkins would rather sort of maybe arrogantly claim are our peers: Duke, Stanford, Harvard, just north of $1 billion. So Hopkins is a significant research enterprise. There is significant capacity within this university that, quite frankly, remains untapped in the context of what we're talking about today and through the InnerSource. So how do you somehow tap into this expertise and capacity in a way that's accessible? But when I say Johns Hopkins University, it's really important to remember that it's all of these things. These are the academic divisions of the university. And this is a gross simplification, certainly, but if you work in a company, you are all sort of working toward the same kind of product or the same kind of service. That's not true here. Each of these divisions have their own products, their own services, their own research, their own teaching methods. And while universities tend to be decentralized generally, Hopkins is incredibly decentralized. And I'll explain that in 2 ways. So typically at most universities, the research dollars and the tuition dollars and the fundraising and so on come through the central administration. they go into the president's office and the provost's office. And those are the two senior administrators, no surprise, who have the most power in the institution because they control the resources. At Hopkins, those financial flows go through the schools first. And there's apparently a conversation that takes place between the deans of each of these divisions, the provost and the president, where they say, all of you need to contribute to a central pool so we can pay for human resources and information technology and all these sort of central services. I would love to be at that meeting. I can't imagine what it's like to be sitting there and hearing your boss say, I need you to give money toward these things. So it's a very complex place, which is a university, and we're making great strides to becoming one university. This is one of the themes our current president, who's been there for 10 years, has really emphasized. But it's really important to remember that these divisions have tremendous autonomy, and therefore have lots of different ways of doing things. One very specific kind of case. One university, we have 24 academic calendars. Can you imagine being a student and told, if you're in this division, your classes begin on this day. If you're taking a course in another division, your classes will begin on another day. So in the midst of all this, we have the libraries. We are also an academic division. So while something like HR, of course, spans across the whole institution, those tend to be administrative functions, right? So you have a lot of functions in the administrative side of the institution that touch all the divisions. We're one of the few academic divisions, being the libraries, that touch all the divisions. We support all the research, we support all the teaching, we support the co-curricular activities, the outreach, the community engagement, and so on. That's a very important role, particularly in a place like Hopkins that is so decentralized, to have this one place that supports all the divisions, that actually interacts and touches all of the divisions. So it's not surprising that in many ways the libraries are sort of the gathering spot, both virtually and physically, of the university. It's a neutral entity, right? We don't necessarily have one particular viewpoint or one particular research agenda. We're supposed to represent all of them. So there's a trust that comes with that. If the library says this is an important agenda for us to pursue, the divisions are less likely to say, well, you're from engineering, so that's why you care about that, right? Why should I care? The library tends to be able to represent, maybe by proxy, but represent the viewpoints of multiple divisions. We also have a value structure in the library that's very important to keep in mind about respecting privacy, and that data are yours. We're not going to take your data and resell it, or use it in ways that you're not intending for them to be used. That also helps very much with the trust aspects of the library. So we have a very important position in a university from both the academic side, but also from the cultural side in terms of the trust and respect that we have. So another view, if you will, of this very complex sort of environment that's Hopkins is that there is a very complex interplay of people, processes, and products that are taking place. And they vary. You can't map that and say, oh, look, this is the way it happens in engineering, therefore it happens that way everywhere. You have researchers who get $10, $50 million grants. You have researchers who get $0 of grants. And that's, both of those are perfectly appropriate. We don't say to the person getting those big grants that you're somehow better, or that your research is more important, or that your teaching is more important. It's just a different way of working. But there's a very complex set of workflows that connect within these divisions and across the divisions. And what I'm proposing is that the library basically sits in the middle of that. And that's why it makes sense to have an open source programs office coming out of the libraries. So as we sit there and think about how all these kinds of relationships, communications, and workflows happen, the library is kind of the gathering spot of the hub for all those to happen. So with that engineering as a liberal art in mind, we're hoping that a university-based OSPO is a way of thinking about how to engineer and maybe even re-engineer some of the ways universities work. So if you were at the reception last night, it was the first time I heard Denise and Jacob say that, you know, Saeed's taking a risk. He's being very brave. So, I mean, in some sense, it's kind of inspiring and empowering, and in other words, a little bit nerve-wracking, right? But if we're going to take this on in the university, there is a natural place where something like this can happen, and I would submit it to the library. Because again, if any of the divisions show up and say, we're going to re-engineer processes, there's immediately a sense of how does your self-interest align with my self-interest? And if it doesn't, why should I work with you? But if the library says there are really interesting ways we might think about doing things differently, there are ways we can collaborate within the institution in ways that are different, then it's received and processed in a very different way. So if I move from that internal view to an external sort of facing view, what we're also hoping the OSPO is a way to interface with all of you sitting in the room, and even people not sitting in the room, and people not represented in the room. As strange as it sounds, what I'm thinking a university-based OSPO can be is kind of an organizational API. Right? Trust me, you do not want to know about all the complexity behind the organization that is Hopkins or any large university. It's a very difficult place to navigate. It's even hard to know who to ask sometimes, where to begin. And you may get a response that you understand or you don't understand. You may get sent to someone else who may or may not be appropriate. So can the OSPO be the place where if you want to interact with the university, either to contribute something, which of course would be very welcome, or to get something from the university, that can be the place to start. And then the OSPO can basically then spread out within the institution, because we're already trying to think about the engineering processes within the institution. We can spread out within the institution and think about who's the right person to talk to, what's the right office, what's the right place, what's the right kind of conversation to have. So I want to give you a couple of examples. So these are very early days. We announced this concept for the first time at OFSCON in Portland in July. And since that time, there's even been a couple of things that are worth really sharing and mentioning. So one is technology transfer. So basically any large research university is going to have an office that focuses on taking the research outputs of an institution and so-called translating them. Now what that typically means is commercializing them, right? Is do we have some sort of software, do we have some sort of technology, a medical device, take your pick. How do we take that and commercialize it? And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. The issue that I have is that is the only pathway that a technology transfer office typically thinks about, because that's the kind of only incentive they have, right? They're told by the institution, this is how you will be successful, is how much commercialization you produce. This is where I think something like the chaos framework would be very interesting to think about. Are there alternative metrics and measures of success that tech transfer offices can start to embrace? What if we say that you've released your software in an open source way and you look at the impact it's had, even if it's not financial? I mean, again, there's nothing to say you couldn't have financial outputs from open source. But are there other metrics that we can use to measure the impact of what we're doing beyond commercialization? And I will tell you that every experience I've had with tech transfer, and I've had multiple experiences with them over the years I've been at Hopkins, they want to understand this. They recognize that open source is important, but they really don't know what to do about it. So I've started to have conversations with the tech transfer folks at Hopkins about if you want to learn about open source, if you want to help the faculty and the researchers figure out what licenses are best, or how do you manage these things, where are the communities you want to work with. They're eager to do it, but they just don't know how to start. And it doesn't hurt that Randall got the chair of computer science interested in this idea, and he sent a message to the tech transfer office saying, hey, we're launching an OSPO, you should talk to these people. So clearly that kind of engagement with the researchers themselves is critical, but the researchers don't want to have that direct conversation with tech transfer. They will do so at the end of the process. We will look to them to get feedback, but they don't want to be the ones actively leading that, and that's what the OSPO, we believe, can do. Another is this group. So I showed you the academic divisions at Hopkins. I could not possibly show you a diagram of all the centers and institutes and research groups that exist at Hopkins. There are probably thousands. One of the ones that I've been involved with since the beginning, and the library has as well, is called the Institute for Data Intensive Engineering and Science. It is one of the few institutes that is cross-divisional. So at last count, I believe there were 6 of the divisions now that participate, or actually 7, sorry, that participate in this group. So it is one of the few cross-divisional kinds of entities. It's become a gathering spot for the people doing a lot of work around big data, around machine learning. and artificial intelligence and so on. They held an event a couple of weeks ago at the business school called Urban Spaces, or Data Science in the City. So an interesting gathering of people from the city government, state government, even federal government, researchers at Hopkins in the room together, talking about how can we work together. And we've got a couple of cases of really good success where there's a researcher who's affiliated with ideas in something called the 21st Century Cities Initiative at Hopkins, who's been working with the Baltimore City Housing and Urban Development Group to model where there may be abandoned buildings. Because one of the things we have to do in Baltimore is think about which of those buildings need to be demolished and which of them can be turned and made occupied and repopulated and so on. So they built a model to look at this, and that's a really good case, an example of how this kind of partnership can work. I was sitting in one of the focus groups at a breakout session, and one of the people from the city said, is there a researcher at Hopkins who I can talk to about getting air pollution measurements? And at this focus group, there were three or four other faculty members from Hopkins sitting in the group, and they said, I don't know, I don't think so. And I said, well, actually, Darren Waugh in the Earth and Planetary Sciences measures. You know, if he doesn't measure that directly, he will know how to get you in contact with people who do. And she said, is he here? I said, yeah, he's actually sitting right over there. So those kinds of relationships can happen in these kinds of settings, but we don't want to rely on individual people. That won't scale, right? And I may not be sitting in the room, or Tamas Pudavari, who I was describing is working with the city, may not be sitting in the room. So at the last board meeting of the Ideas Group, we were talking about how do we engage with city organizations and ideas? Because the model for membership right now is a researcher at Hopkins sponsors another researcher or a graduate student or a postdoc, and you become an individual member of this group. We didn't have a model in place for a city department coming forward and saying, I would like to be an Ideas affiliate or member. And what I suggested was, that could be a role for the OSPO, right? It's sitting in the library. We don't have to necessarily say we are researchers and therefore we want to know what your research outputs are. We want to know what the impact of what you're doing may be. And the service aspect of the library aligns very well with the service aspect of a city department. So the Ideas Group agreed that the OSPO will become the interface for city departments that come forward and say, we'd like to work with ideas, here's what we'd like to do, can we become an affiliate or a member, and who do we work with? So this is a real breakthrough in some sense for the researchers at Hopkins to basically trust this office to say, yes, we're willing to work with you to figure out how to make some of these relationships happen. And all of this has to do with conversations and exchanges of ideas. These are pictures from the whiteboards last night. I was very happy to see the amount of activity and the amount of energy around sharing these ideas. I'll also note that one of the software developers I worked with was at the reception last night, and he told me that one of the caterers went up to one of the boards and wrote something. So I don't know if when you go to these events, I go out of my way to say thank you to the caterers and the AV people. Sometimes they tend to become invisible. We have these very nice, wonderful gatherings, and we don't notice the people that are actually helping contribute to make it a nice event. I think it's really great that this person went beyond that and actually said, I have ideas. I want to put them on the board. That's the kind of conversation that we need to foster, and we believe this office can do that. So I will certainly attribute Nick Jones, who is my former advisor, is now the provost at Penn State, who said this to me, who really influenced the way I think about things. What I'll also say is that this is very much the beginning of a journey for me personally and professionally through this OSPO. I really welcome your ideas. I may not get it immediately like I didn't with this phrase, but I promise you I'll think about it. It'll percolate and hopefully it'll coalesce into something really useful that we can scale, not only for Hopkins, but other universities, so that we can work with all sorts of communities. So I appreciate your time and attention, and be happy to take any questions. Thank you. Do you need these?
Hi, I'm Gil. In thinking of the technology assets that you have within the institution, there's the stuff that you need to run an organization, regardless of whether it's an educational organization. I mean, it could be a factory, right? You have all of this technology that you just need to run an organization. And then there's all the technology that, in particular, because you're a university, there's all this creation of technology that the university itself produces as a product or a byproduct. At what level do you see the ASPO focusing on in terms of like getting its grounding? Is it in the infrastructure of the institutional level, IT decisions, or at the output and product of the educational staff themselves?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I guess I'll begin by saying that one of the ways I think universities tend to get things done is through agitation. It's possible for someone to show up with a top-down kind of approach and say, we're going to do the following. But not surprisingly, faculty in particular don't necessarily respond well to thou shalt do the following. So there probably has to be a multiple-pronged approach. But what I would say is that if we can begin with the researchers who are producing that latter category of outputs you were talking about, which are more sort of cutting edge, speculative, and so on, that tends to be a more powerful way of initiating any kind of change. So if they were to say, I produced this, but it was really a pain because we don't have the following policy around open source software, that tends to be very powerful. So the example of the chair of CS contacting tech transfer is a good example of that, right? I can contact tech transfer and they'll respond, but when the chair of the computer science department says something, it carries much more weight and much more credibility and impact than if I were to do it.
Hi, Sayeed. Thanks for speaking today, and thanks also again for hosting us last night. I really appreciate that. I was wondering, I don't know if it's for you or perhaps for the computer science chair, but to what degree you feel that you're interested in providing education for the computer science students in open source participation and culture, so that we get engineers that are leaving school with that mindset and aptitude.
I'm really glad you mentioned that. I didn't put in the early progress slide things that are not quite yet developed. So Jacob introduced me to Chris Anichek, and one of the first things he said was exactly what you just pointed out, is Hopkins is no different than any other university producing people who know how to code, but they don't know how to work together, and they don't know how to collaborate. And we spend 3 to 6 months sort of orienting them in this, stop showing me the brilliant code that only you know how it works, to working, and I'm preaching to the choir. So that is a really important curriculum kind of conversation, right? That's the kind of thing we can take to a chair of computer science or the dean of engineering and say, look, our graduates, if they have a better sense of how to work once they leave this place, they're going to have an advantage, right? Quite frankly, in terms of where they get placed and what they do, and let's be blunt about it. Once they become wealthy and give money back to the institution, there's all sort of cascading downstream effects. But yeah, there's absolutely core educational potential in terms of having these kinds of conversations.
Okay. So I'm going to ask you a question that I often ask new change agents. First, welcome to the Army. What's your biggest fear about this work you're undertaking?
Yeah, my biggest fear is it's very diffuse right now, right? So you talked about when you interact with sort of the senior level of an organization. And broadly speaking, you're talking about corporations have required training and so on. That's not true often. We do have required training, but it tends to be very much around legal issues and compliance and things like that. There's no required training about working differently. So how do we do this in a very diffuse environment is my biggest fear. But absolutely that has to come through the kinds of partnerships that we've already started to form. And for better or worse, I have a very unique kind of advantage in that I've been a student at Hopkins, I've been a faculty member at Hopkins, I'm an administrator, I'm a library staff person. I have multiple roles, so I kind of recognize lot of hard work, it takes a lot of effort, and this is a new context for me to do that. So that's partially what sort of keeps me up here.
Well, to quote Russ Rutledge, I would say, bite off a small piece,
Right.
something that's actually attainable.
Yep.
And be sure that you capture the value that you created so that you can
Right.
send that up to management, right?
Yeah.
But, you know, then ask for a little more, and if they tell you no, figure a pivot out that's gonna get you the same effect. Because there is one, there always is one.
That's great advice. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Cool. Well, we'll be here to help, you know.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you.